Thanks a lot, everyone, for coming along to this session. It's a couple of statements at the start is I first agreed to do this some time ago, and since then the whole scene has changed a lot. And so, as I've been thinking through this issue of comparison, how I do it, how I'm doing it, and what it might mean has changed a lot, maybe changed completely. And so it is very much a sort of thinking in progress. It's not, and please take it in that light. It's not there's no definitive statements in this. If there are, then that's not intended. It's really some ideas which are evolving. Today, this is a very sketchy outline of what I want to do. We've got two risks that we could argue are systemic risks, at least in terms of their impacts, the summer fires and the virus. And there's been a fair bit of speculation and writing in that I've seen in Australian comments and commentary that we're very fortunate. What if these events occurred together? How would our system have coped? I mean, that seems to be something. I take the view that they have occurred together and they are continuing to occur together, and that far from being an absolute catastrophe, which seems to be the tenor of a lot of the comments I've seen, it might be something that has saved us. Certainly, it's probably helped us with our good fortune. Then I want to look at, well, who's the contrast. Of course, these two events present some interesting contrasts, like who's running it, who's running the show, or who appears to be running it, how the risk communication has been done, the whole issue of which people we see as panic buying, or is it really something else? Are people just doing what they're told? There's the question of plans and preparation. I mean, there's a lot of, in the fire field, there's a history of planning and preps and rehearsals as well. And that might be an interesting, I feel that's an interesting contrast with the pandemic. Not that there was an absence of planning in Australia for pandemics. It just wasn't anything like the fire planning. And then there's the recovery issue. And I think it's one of the critical issues is that to bear in mind, to keep in mind that we are recovering from both. The fires seem a while ago. I have an overview. I declare a slight bias at the start. I can see some people online who think that it would take hours to declare all my biases, but I'm just the main ones. But I'm just going to say that I think we've been very fortunate in Australia. I don't think there's any question of that. And this is obviously from the United Kingdom. We have kept the virus out of our hospital system to the extent that it's been able to cope with what's presented. That is not the case in many other countries, which we're more than aware of. I think it's hard to overstate how fortunate we are, because what happens in England and the English government is of considerable appeal to many people in the Australian government. So, and there was admiration in the early on for the British Chief Medical Officer, for example. I'm very glad that admiration didn't go into any kind of action. So let's consider for a minute the last summer. Seems to me it seems a long while ago, but this was mid-January, I think mid-January, this slide. It's a Google or Yahoo image, and it shows basically the extent of the fires. To a certain extent, it shows a lot of the population distribution, of course, which a lot of these things tend to. But it does, I want to remind us of just how extensive these were. They started in September, it's the other thing. So they weren't short-lived. There was also the smoke. I don't know, my cough, I think, is just a cough from the cold and wet. I don't think it's something more serious, but you're at a safe distance, so it's okay. So And just to remind us that this wasn't actually just a bit of an inconvenience for Australia, I just picked out a few things almost at random. The Australian Institute, this is from in last December, early December, the Sydney Morning Herald had a headline about we've got the world's worst air quality, schools are closing and outdoor activities are being cancelled. What they don't say is, of course, a lot of indoor activities are also cancelled, like art galleries, because the risk of pollution damaging exhibits. Just want to highlight that, and the tourism, of course, that New York Times, the top piece there, and early in the year, basically warning people about travelling to Australia. I think we need to reflect that actually, especially for our tourism and many sectors, this has been going on for a lot longer than the virus, than the lockdown. And their hope for recovery was, after the bushfires and smoke and so on, was halted abruptly by the virus. But unlike many other countries, we already were in a fairly powerless position, or many of our some of our sectors. Thought it'd be good in this, like, to just reflect, as I said, I've said we were lucky. Well, it might seem, how could we be lucky? I think there's been a little bit written about this, but paywalls have prevented me from accessing it. One of the issues I find about working at home and being incompetent at these things. And so this is just a very partial timeline. I originally had in there some wonderful statements from Donald Trump, but you know, there's a limit to what one can put in. I wanted to show that WHO first reported on social media that there was a pretty serious problem on the 6th of January. So, but from us, apart from the coincidence of the fires and the fires in the local area around Canberra, with major action by the Australian government with respect to the virus, I just wanted to highlight a couple of timing that I think is probably pure good fortune. So we can see there that on the 1st of February, foreign arrivals, the Australian government basically blocked travellers from China, and everyone had to quarantine and all that. That was the 1st of February. Now, February is a time when a lot of foreign students come to Australia. So basically we're in a situation, at that point where we haven't had a lot of tourism. It has really fallen away, international tourism, especially from China and from Europe. And some areas were in a dire state because they depend primarily on Chinese tourism, say in North Queensland. It just hadn't happened to anything like the extent that they'd hoped for. Then in February, basically people from China were not permitted to enter. So this meant that apart from tourism and so on, as the air cleared, that we have about 700,000 foreign students. I think that's quite a number that it's a very large number, and most people have no appreciation of that. It's it's nearly 1 million, not a few tens of thousands. Roughly 30% are from China. And that group was essentially, didn't come. Some did, but mostly they did not come to Australia. So now if the virus had been a month later, they all would have been here and potentially bringing all that with them. So perhaps this was one reason why, despite a lot of other things that perhaps could have gone better, we were saved from very widespread community spread of the virus. It's just a thought, but I think if you accept this luck, it's luck and it's a coincidence of events. So I think it's, so let's start to look at the actual comparison of how it was run. We had Shane Fitzsimmons, the head of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, was not the public face of the fires, but certainly maybe he was here in New South Wales anyway. Other states had their own, but New South Wales was probably the busiest. As I said, from September right through till February. I think it was the 13th of February when he declared that all the fires in the state were contained. They weren't out, but they were no longer threatening. One could ask, well, how would he have gone if he had to if he had to get consensus with all the other states and territories, or even if it was just with the fire chiefs of all the other states and territories, on managing the fire, even for major operational decisions? I don't know that he would have gone very well, actually. I think it's but that in a way is what the cabinet, the national cabinet, seemed to be trying to do. Of course, we already had COAG and all the rest of it, and a lot of people have been very critical of this extra layer of bureaucracy and clunky decision making. You'd have to say that it sort of has worked, whether it was necessary or not. And it had to overcome a really major impediment, which we'll look at in a minute. One of the side issues, which I'm not going to look at, is that there's no question, I think, that some states, in particular New South Wales, which has been by far the worst affected in Australia, would have taken action, or appears to be the worst affected, would have taken more action earlier if it had not been for federal pressure otherwise, and they wouldn't be easing the lockdown, I'm pretty convinced, right now, except for federal pressure. So there's issues there which may be good, but maybe not. So as I said, I think it's an extraordinary contrast in approach and styles, and it might be, again, it seems a long while ago. The cabinet was put together in mid-March, and they were going to have a weekly meeting. Pretty soon that was shown that there wasn't going to be much use to manage something that was doubling every few days. So the major impediment that they had to overcome was, of course, set out here, that Shane Fitzsimmons belongs to the most trusted group in Australia, firefighters, and our political leaders, at least before the virus, belonged to the least trusted group. I mean, this is an older survey a couple of years ago, because I couldn't, the most recent ones didn't have the detail I needed, but the most recent one taken before the virus showed that politicians were no longer the least trusted. There was the CEOs of some particular sector, I can't remember mercifully what sector it was, that were even less trusted than our political leaders. So they had to the politicians had to overcome this, and I think on the whole they managed, which is it's just quite extraordinary. And perhaps so in going through this and thinking about it, I tried to think, well, I also tried to think, well, try not just to see it from a more traditional emergency management, fire management point of view. I think if we consider that the virus was global, with all the geopolitics and everything else, some of us find very tedious, but that's the reality of it. The fire was within the boundaries of Australia, more or less, even though the impacts were very widespread and there was international involvement. Basically, it was within Australia. So perhaps given the global nature of the virus and the necessity for external border control and so on, international rescue flights and all the rest, a national cabinet approach might be the best solution. Maybe it's a bit challenging sometimes, but it could well be a reasonable approach given the alternatives, whatever they might be. So one of the things this group had to do, that's our leaders in the virus, they had to do a lot of planning. Now, one of the differences with the fire sector and the more traditional emergency management sector is that the fire and emergency management sector, I wouldn't say they have a very long tradition of it, but they have a long tradition, you could say, of planning and of rehearsals. So mostly there's a huge amount of rehearsal on fire response and fire protection and all the rest of it. Our health sector doesn't do that, regardless of what they might say. They are always operating pretty much always operating at capacity, and there's not a huge amount of space for, say, large-scale rehearsals. We do have, but that said, there is a pandemic plan. Our group actually was part of the group that reviewed it when it was out in about 12 years ago. We take no responsibility because there were aspects of it that we thought were wrong, and I can see that they're still in the current plan. But they don't. Perhaps we can see they don't, because we've been fortunate. That hasn't mattered so much. There's been a lot of criticism of it, saying that we didn't do any planning since then. I find it quite surprising in a way, because we don't have a public, as far as I know, public national risk register like most countries, or many countries. But if we did, a pandemic or a major epidemic would probably be, as it is in most countries, the number one threat. So you'd expect there to be some planning about it. And look, I'm sure there is. And here, of course, is the Australian Health Sector Emergency Response Plan and the West Australian Plan, and so on. There's lots of these plans. One of the things I wanted to draw attention to is that the priorities in the plan. Now, in the national plan, the first priority is identifying and characterising. It's up here on the left. Whoops. Sorry, I have no idea how I get back to this. Yeah. Characterising the nature of the virus and the severity of the disease in Australia. The second priority is to minimise morbidity and mortality. Any fire or emergency management plan that did things that way around they'd be in jail, or they certainly wouldn't have a job, and the press would no doubt vilify them. And it's quite interesting that, in other words, the focus on saving lives and safety is absolutely number one in emergency and fire management in Australia. And the various inquiries, the Black Saturday inquiry, said that wasn't enough. They had to make it more explicit. It was pretty explicit. And so I think it's very interesting that there's this completely different approach. I mean, you could say that we need to understand the flames more, but it wouldn't go down well. But, and this highlights that this is actually a seriously systemic threat and requiring a whole of society approach, with the potential to seriously damage the economy. And I would argue that is one reason why we need to understand the severity of the disease, of the threat, a lot more than perhaps we do in other hazards. It is quite interesting because the difference is quite striking. Okay. Part of planning, disaster planning, is to have communication. There's been a lot of communication. In fire, bushfire risk communication is very well established. It's gone through a number of major changes, especially after Black Saturday in 2009. And it's become more standardised, and the idea of actually warning people and letting them know in advance as much as one can is now orthodoxy. And our own studies have shown that most people are aware of what is meant. Not everybody, but most people. It doesn't mean they do it. That's a very important difference, but they are aware. Perhaps 2/3, 3/4 are aware of the population, are aware of what these things mean. If not to the exact detail and wording that's in the official documents, but generally speaking. So, of course, it's there's a lot of organisations promoting what should be done and not done. This is a QBE insurance, so it's not directly a government piece of government education. And when I looked at it, I thought, there's nothing in there that I think is actually wrong, but there's certainly some partial issues. For example, I thought the designated neighbourhood safer place at the centre bottom there was a last resort only, that sort of things, but they're arguably minor, and it shows how embedded the key ideas are in the Australian system. So if we consider the virus, we get a slightly different picture. I mean, this was from The Guardian, Australia. I don't know whether you can see it. My view of it's slightly obscured, actually. But essentially, it says Australians are crying out for clear messaging on coronavirus. Rambling politicians are told. This was the middle of March, 24th of March. Sorry, 24th of March. And you can see the general view there is that the messages are confusing, and that politicians are giving rambling answers, trying to avoid being direct. But I guess that's what politicians are good at. They're mostly pretty good at at giving an answer that perhaps doesn't specifically answer the question because it's pretty awkward. So there is, you couldn't say it was a great success, and this is to be seen in the context that there's a lot of guidebooks, guides, how to do it, documents and so on in the federal bureaucracy and in the state bureaucracy. And as usual, once it gets away from their control, of course, people do their own thing. But one thing that perhaps is overlooked a bit in assessing some of this, and is a complete contrast to the fires, is that in the fires, the material came from Australia, essentially. Whereas in this one, I would say a lot of the material came from overseas. And so people could see what was going on, especially once it started to rampage through Italy, people could see what was going on in Europe. And of course, we'd seen it in Asia. And so what our politicians and our risk communication bodies were doing was important, but it was only part of the picture. And there was a lot of other stuff going on which I think sensitized people and got them ready for it. I mean, you could argue it's very clear. I don't think it's clear at all, but this is somewhat part of an attempt to explain isolation a little bit better. But we have to say that overall it seems to have worked. There's lots of different goes out of apologies for the quality of the images. That's a New Zealander one. So part of the whole communication process, of course, is to get people to prepare. I mean, the fire agencies and their affiliates spend a lot of energy and effort persuading people to get ready for the season, have the right kit, have your planning, decide what you're going to do, clean up around the house, all that kind of stuff. And the same, I think, applies to the virus. If we see if we see it in that light, that people were preparing for quarantine, they weren't panic buying. They were preparing for quarantine. And one of the things that struck me as quite interesting, yes, there have been some pretty interesting videos that have gone viral, but of course there's millions of Australians shopping. As part of risk communication, Australian Emergency Management Organisations, including fire agencies, have for decades urged households to have supplies on hand in case they're cut off. This could be from, usually it's for a few days, but there was a push about a decade ago or a bit more by the Australian Red Cross, with the support of a lot of agencies, arguing that you should have 14 days supply on hand. Of course, it was assumed that you would be at home, but in fires, floods, cyclones, we evacuate. So there's a lot of issues with this as usual, and I think very few people did it. There were a lot of surveys about it, but no one's actually going into people's homes to check. No one in a small apartment could do that, and so on. Okay. But then it suddenly seemed like a good idea when you thought you might be quarantined for 2 weeks with no notice, and a lockdown was looming. And we know overseas that there were lockdowns. I follow the Austrian scene closely because I have a job there and I would be there, but you know. And the government gave 2 days notice of a curfew, not a lockdown, a curfew. You could not go out. And so, except, you know, exceptional circumstances. So I think there was and I heard myself here in Australia, government officials of various sorts, before they all started to say the same thing, saying, well, you need to be ready to be isolated for some weeks, and you should have whatever medications you need. And that varied from having a few weeks to a few months, depending on what website you looked at. And as someone who was rushing around trying to get drugs for friends who had particular problems like asthma, there wasn't any. So it was actually a bit of a problem. But the message was clear. You need to be ready for weeks of isolation. And there was little on exactly what this could mean. There are other things too. If we're going to be at home, a large proportion of the food eaten in Australia is eaten out, but suddenly that wasn't going to happen. It was going to be at home. So some people became a little overwrought, and our Prime Minister said, stop it. But he didn't say what the government was doing to make sure there wasn't going to be a problem for those that were a bit stressed about it and were making a statement of confidence in the reliability of the food supply system. Now, we've done our own assessment quite a few years ago of the Australian food supply system, and I have to say it's performed much better than we expected. There's a system that is just in time and operating at capacity. So if there's suddenly an extra demand for something, it's not easy to fulfill it if it's very large scale. So I think it's actually done extremely well. Of course, that's an Australian image, but this is a US site giving advice, and they suggest you need 3 months supply of medications, for example, and so on. So people looking on the web, I don't think they're necessarily looking just at the Australian government site. Another aspect of what we do and in planning is capacity expansion, and to deal with extra large events or events that go on too long or in some way or another challenge us. Now, in the fire area, this is well established, and it's part of regional politics as well. We draw on overseas firefighters, traditionally from the United States, Canada, and New Zealand, but now from other places as well, apparently. And also, of course, the government almost, in my opinion, fell over itself to bring in reservists on the grounds that because these people are all people with jobs, so they had to quit their jobs to come in. And you can see them there all helping out with koala rescue, which I think is rather wonderful. And there are some Papua New Guinea troops who also came down to assist. So it's actually quite a well-rehearsed, you could say it's a well-oiled machine in terms of how we expand our firefighting capacity. That's quite separate to whether this is a good way of doing capacity or whatever, but it's there. So if we then consider the virus, I mean, in January, we saw the Chinese building new 1,000-bed hospitals in about a week and repurposing very large buildings. The English went one better. The English military built a 4,000-bed hospital, which is shown there. And that's an overflow ward in Italy. So what did we do? I mean, it's sort of quite challenging. Well, our health minister here in Canberra announced that they were repurposing the ice rink, but as a morgue, not as a hospital. This perhaps wasn't the best thing for public confidence building. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened, and I accept that, you know, we all make mistakes and errors, and perhaps it wasn't meant to be a public statement. But the thing that struck me, I mean, we all have our personal networks. I wish I didn't know so many people in the health system in New South Wales. The doctors were from early March screaming for things to be done. And when I heard the chief of infectious diseases at Westmead Hospital and in charge of, it appeared, the hospital response in Sydney for this virus, announced on radio that the hospital had organised 12 beds, I figured I was going to die because I was not going to be one of the people who was going to get one of those beds. So it's quite striking, actually. I feel that our lack of taking this seriously in initial stages, when everyone else was trying to, or looked like they were trying to, and the medics in some of the big Sydney hospitals, we know, were trying to persuade the bureaucracy that they needed to shift patients out of some of the wards so they could prepare for virus cases. This happened eventually, but late in the day. So I felt that our capacity planning was not really what it could have been or should have been. But we bought ourselves time, and that's important. In this sort of event, as in most of these events, the outcome is what actually is critical. There have been mistakes both in the fire and accidents, both in the fire, with the fires, and of course with the virus. And the Ruby Princess is just one. It's the worst example, but many cruise ships had problems, no question. And that one's been investigated by the New South Wales Police. I mean, I think, you know, when one looks closely at a big event, especially one that runs for months. I mean, I think a lot of people have said, colleagues and researchers, well, if we compare it with Black Saturday, it was like this and we've done much better or whatever. Black Saturday lasted for hours or a day, really, in terms of the actual fires and almost most of the damage. Not all of it, but most of the damage. Both these events that we're looking at here went for months. Seriously, went for months. And and I think, and we're extensive. As far as we're concerned, they're the whole nation, more or less. Both, of course, the virus a lot more. So, you know, we're not perfect. And I think it's Mark Crosler who said, you know, we need to understand that we're not perfect, and everyone needs to try very hard not to make mistakes, not to be negligent. But we know that people work shifts much longer than they should in a crisis, and that's just one factor that can lead to problems. And also they might be operating in very different circumstances to what they're trained or expected. So I'm just highlighting that there are mistakes and accidents and perhaps negligence that shouldn't have occurred, but we also need to understand as the public and media that that we can't expect perfection, especially in something that is so novel and goes on for so long. Now, I've just talked a lot about planning and preparedness, and I just want to say that maybe it's overrated. It's just a suggestion, I mean, I realise that as someone who's argued for it for decades, it's a bit of a hard thing to say, but this is one of, you know, you can find anything you like on the web. This is the Global Health Security Index, preparation to deal with a pandemic. And I have to say the first 3 countries listed on that have done atrociously badly at dealing with the pandemic, and yet they're rated as the top nations. The US, United Kingdom and Netherlands all have very high death rates. And in the hundreds, we're next. We have a death rate in the single digits as a rate. And I don't know about Canada and so on, but I'm just making the point that, yeah, maybe it's not always cracked up to be. And so if it isn't, well, what is? Well, what we've shown, and I wouldn't have necessarily expected this, actually, is that our government, our national government, working with the states in a fairly cooperative, it's not as cooperative as it appears, of course, but it's fairly cooperative, has exhibited an extraordinary amount of flexibility in terms of their major strategic policies and adaptability to circumstances that I'm sure none of them ever imagined they'd have to deal with. But they've more or less done it. I'm not saying they've done it in the sense it's all over, but they've been flexible and they've adapted and they've put in place policies and so on that they would have not imagined they'd be doing a few months ago. And in a way, I feel this is fundamental to the definition of a resilient nation. I've argued before, I suppose, that our preoccupation with resilience is all about individuals and households. Well, in this case, it's about the nation. And I think the nation has been, so far, I mean, it's early days, I know, has shown enormous resilience with slightly surprising with the leadership. And just to finish up on this point, and then I think I'll go to the final points. We're very fond of planning in our sector and as researchers. And some of my colleagues, I don't think anyone online, have railed against the apparent lack of plans and the lack of preparation. And some of them have even said, oh, look, I set all this out in a paper 5 years ago. Why haven't they read it? I thought, well, you don't know that they haven't read it. They might have read it, but they ignored it, or they have decided it's one of 1,000 items they took cognizance of. So, and we know that the planning process is what is of value rather than a plan as an entity stuck in time, and the ability to adapt to circumstances, because circumstances almost never exactly as imagined or as set down in some politically acceptable plan. A national pandemic plan is something that has to be politically acceptable to the politicians of the day. So it's probably not going to be that useful 10 years down the track. It might be. So I think we need to, those of us who work in the field need to shift our focus a bit and work a little bit more on the value of flexibility and rapid adjustment in the face of novel circumstances with great uncertainty. Of course, we have no choice in this case, but in our work we do. So I'm just going to make a couple of comments on recovery, and then that's sort of it. I think a lot of us imagine, I mean, perhaps not a lot of the people online, but I think a lot of people imagine recovery is going to be like this. we're all going to have a lot of fun at the end of it, and everything will be open and raging. These are actually taken, obviously taken beforehand, and I think one of the Bondi Beach ones perhaps was taken after the announcement was made that they shouldn't be there. But anyway, or will it be more like this? And actually, from what I can see happening around the world, it's a lot more like this at the moment, which may not be quite what we would like, but and the difficulty for governments and well, for anyone who's giving advice in this area is, well, what sort of recovery guidance exists? I mean, there's a lot of recovery guidebooks and documents and some recent publications that attempt to synthesize the kind of global thinking on the topic. And that essentially comes down to community-led and that sort of thing. But we're not dealing with that sort of situation. I think, well, there are communities, of course, but we're dealing with the nation and then global recovery. And I think it's important that we don't forget about the fires and the considerable ecological damage, and of course, considerable damage to regional economies. It's not just, we're all suffering economically at the moment, not all sectors by any means, but all cities. But the fires particularly damaged areas outside the major centres, and also, as I said, the ecological damage. What we've got is this enormous economic disruption and distortion right now because governments are subsidising and supporting people in sectors in a way that they could not, especially this government, could not have imagined doing. But it's important to acknowledge some sectors, IT and home improvements, are busier than ever, while others have almost ceased to function. And they are tended to be the ones that have gone down, tend to be the ones that were also in trouble to some extent as a result of our summer. Now, when we look forward, governments are looking, I know we're looking at past recessions and stimulus packages, but there might be better analogues. There's a number of some people have suggested, well, there are a number of analogues when you get enormous disruption but no damage, no actual structural damage. And they can occur, in the past they've occurred through industrial action of various sorts, massive infrastructure failure, fuel shortages for various reasons, epidemics, which are mini pandemics, but are very different in, of course, effect, although they can affect a regional economy very badly. Economic collapses from terrorism, and communities also, especially in regional Australia, isolated for long periods by flooding, and so on. I feel that one thing as researchers we could do, and I'm on the edge of a group that's trying to do this, it's an international group, to examine such events and others that come to our attention for their potentially relevant lessons. And one of the issues in all of this is that one of the themes of disaster recovery research and advocacy, including by the NGOs like the Red Cross, is that there's an opportunity, people want to go back to normal and politicians say want to go back to what was there, but actually often, especially after a long period, that's not possible. The situation is quite different. We cannot go back to what was before, say, summer, because the sector keeps evolving. There'll be some major businesses that have gone or changed or whatever. And maybe there's an opportunity to improve things and make the industries and the economy more resilient. It's true, most people seem to want to jump back to where we were, but I think we're going to have to accept that won't be possible. So what can we do to improve things? I don't have the answer, but we need to work on it. So to conclude, with some suggestions. As I said, these are suggestions. I'm not making any definitive statements. And as I've constructed this talk, it's gone from, it's changed quite dramatically because of the evolution of the circumstances that we're all in. I think we've been very fortunate. I mean, when you look across the world, there's a handful of countries that, wealthy countries, Australia, New Zealand, Austria to some extent, that have very, very low death tolls, in death rates in the virus. We're incredibly fortunate, orders of magnitude better off than many. Our political leaders have, I think, mostly performed. I mean, look at you could argue that the approval rating of state leaders is tightly correlated with two things, how few deaths there are in their states, but also how assertive they've been against the feds. That's what I'm just saying, you know, so they're not the states that have actually acted as states. Risk communication for the virus has been confusing, despite lots of guides and experience on this, but the general message got through, despite all that. And I would argue, though, I would argue one area perhaps but we could always do a lot better, I have to say, in that area. I'd argue that one area I would probably distinguish myself a little bit from the general view is that most people, I think, sensibly prepared for quarantine and lockdowns, as opposed to random, crazy panic buy. I'm not saying there was none of it, but, you know, as someone who had to hunt for toilet paper for myself and a whole lot of neighbours, but I didn't find it, you know, that difficult. When you're old, you get in that special category of elderly people, so it was all right. There are pandemic plans, but it was a case of learning and adapting on the job. So the plans might have been a starting point. I'm not convinced that they were that important, but we don't know, because there was such massive uncertainty. There was uncertainty in the fires as well. I mean, Shane made the statement that the predictive models simply weren't working anymore. But there's a lot of experience in running and managing fires, even very difficult and extensive fires. The pandemic was a very novel situation, and people did have to learn and adapt on the run. I think the flexible adaptive approach has certainly worked for Australia very well, and it highlights the resilience of the nation. And that's something I think that it'd be nice if we could work on. We are recovering from both the fires and the virus. There's probably going to be other waves of the virus. Hopefully we can manage them as well. Just what I was saying a minute ago is that recovery needs to be future focused. It's not, especially after this length of time, we're not going to go back wholesale to what was there a few months or 6 months ago. Some bits, of course, but there's also an opportunity